For those who come here seeking God, may God go with you. For those who come embracing life, may life return your affections. And for those who come to seek a path, may a way be found, and the courage to take it step by step. In his inaugural address on January 20th, 1961, newly elected President John Fitzgerald Kennedy uttered the famous words, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And while much of that speech focused on the Cold War with the Soviet Union that wasn't very cold at that moment in history, his famous line really wasn't about that. If we go back to the text of his speech, we find that he preceded that line about service with these words, "Now the trumpet summons us again, not as a call to bear arms, though arms we need, not as a call to battle, though embattled we are, but a call to bear the burden of a long twilight struggle, year in and year out, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, a struggle against the common enemies of man, tyranny, poverty, disease, and war itself. Can we forge against these enemies a grand and global alliance, north and south, east and west, that can assure a more fruitful life for all mankind? Will you join in that historic effort?" JFK's call to service rings in the ears of many of us who grew up in the latter part of the 20th century. It led thousands to service in organizations like the Peace Corps and VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. It led to the formation of countless nonprofits and NGOs, many of which continue today to battle the persistent problems of poverty, disease, and social disorder. For many, serving our communities is a deeply embedded civic duty. I remember when I was growing up, my father, who was far from a Kennedy Democrat, served as president of our school board and as a volunteer trustee for the local hospital. Some of you here today have followed Kennedy's call, perhaps intentionally, perhaps unwittingly, to serve in public offices to the benefit of our local boroughs and townships. And we thank you for your service, for those who do serve. And just this week, in his address to Congress on Thursday, Pope Francis echoed this call to service when he proclaimed the following. He said, "Each son or daughter of a given country has a mission, a personal and social responsibility to defend and preserve the dignity of your fellow citizens in the tireless and demanding pursuit of the common good. A political society," he said, "endures when it seeks as a vocation to satisfy common needs by stimulating the growth of all its members, especially those in situations of greater vulnerability or risk." Our civic duty to serve is likely obvious to all of us here. Like me, you've probably grown up not just with JFK's speech, but with your own role models too. But our call to serve comes not just from our role as citizens of a free and democratic society. Its source is a deeper well even than that. It's not surprising that the Pope's call to service was made in the opening minutes of his speech to Congress, because service is at the core of all the world's religions. For example, in the Hindu Bhagavad Gita and in parallel passages of the Tao Te Ching, the way of service is described as the fundamental principle by which God creates and sustains the universe. Service is the fundamental principle by which God sustains and creates the universe. The Russian philosopher and theologian Nikolai Buryaev has told us this: "The question of bread for myself is a material question. The question of bread for my neighbor is a spiritual question." And it was Dorothy Day, the Catholic activist cited by the Pope this week, who gave us the image of service as a pebble cast into a pond, creating ripples that spread in all directions. Our own Unitarian Universalist faith, too, calls us to serve one another. Ours is a rich history of extending ourselves to respond to the needs of others. Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists have long been leaders in social movements to raise up others from poverty, to feed the hungry, to help the homeless. Role models abound, from Unitarian Clara Barton, who was moved by the human devastation of the Civil War to start the organization that would become the Red Cross, to Horace Mann, a tireless advocate for free public education for all. And then there was Dorothea Dix, who's been called the most visible humanitarian reformer of the 19th century for the work that she did with those struggling with mental illness. But today I'm going to ask you to forget all the luminaries of our deep, illustrious past. Forget the names that are inscribed on memorial plaques and in town squares. Forget perhaps even for a few moments the Pope and JFK. I want to instead give you another name and to tell you another story. A story about Alice. Because Alice needs to be remembered and Alice needs to be talked about. And even though there's no monument planted in her honor in a park in her hometown, it's her story that I want to share. Alice Hodsdon was her name, and I will bet, with the exception of one person in this room, you've never heard of her. Alice Hodsdon, when we arrived at the First Universalist Church in Yarmouth, Maine, was firmly ensconced as a matriarch of that church. Now, if you don't know what a church matriarch is, it's basically a woman whose longevity and contributions to the community afford her special status. In a small church, a matriarch holds a position of great respect and great power. She doesn't hold any official position in the church. She's not on the board. She's not an officer or anything like that. And nor does she need to be a big financial contributor. But basically, in a small church where there is a matriarch, if you want to get anything done, you need to have the matriarch on your side. With little more than a nod or a suspiciously raised eyebrow, a matriarch can bless or sink a project. So Alice was a matriarch of the Yarmouth Church. And she was a matriarch by virtue of her longevity, but also, and probably more so, by virtue of her service to the congregation. When Irene and I got to the church in the late 1980s, Alice had been a member for some 50 years. I remember how Alice and Bob would always sit in the same pew, about where Kelly's sitting today, 3 rows up from the back on the left side, and woe be to any newcomer who sat in their pew. Fortunately, we never made that rookie mistake. But Bob and Alice sat toward the back because Bob, even in his 80s, was still the head usher. And he needed to get up during the service and go out the back door and climb up to the choir loft, up this little creaky staircase, so he could take a head count from up above. And he would enter the number of people in the church service in a little ancient ledger book that he kept tucked away up there. Alice and Bob celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary in the church, and yes, Irene did make the cake. Alice's story, as I came to know it, as we came to know it, was the stuff of legend at First Universalist Church of Yarmouth. She joined the church as a young woman, and she immediately put her musical talent to good use. You see, Alice kept the books for Bob's construction business, but she also was a piano teacher out of her home. And so immediately upon joining the church, she volunteered to become the church organist. And she served as the church organist for more than 40 years. That's right, every Sunday for 40 years, as a volunteer, she would play the music for the worship services. But this wasn't her most substantial contribution to the church. Like many churches back in the mid-20th century, First Universalist had a women's auxiliary. And I don't know if Alice founded it. Do you know if Alice? I don't know that she founded it, but she was a longtime member of the women's auxiliary. The women's auxiliary was a group of women in the church who got together both to socialize and to help serve the congregation and the wider community. They'd organize bake sales and clothing drives, yard sales, and the like, simultaneously raising money for the church and doing some good for the town. Alice chaired the women's auxiliary for more than 40 years. But the story doesn't end there. In the 1970s, First Universalist was struggling. Membership had eroded significantly. It was hard to keep up with the cost of maintaining and repairing the building, which at that time was already about 150 years old. Then the oil crisis hit, and the cost of heating fuel skyrocketed. It became too expensive to heat the sanctuary. So the small and hearty band of church members, including Bob and Alice, would meet in the small church vestry in the basement. Talk of closing the church for good became the constant topic of board meetings and coffee time. With only a couple dozen members left, the future looked bleak. But Alice wasn't ready to throw in the towel. It was Alice and the other members of the Women's Auxiliary who went into action to raise supplemental funds for the church. And the way they did it was to start a tradition that continued for nearly 30 years after. Every other Saturday, the women of the church would offer up a bean supper to the community. For a small charge, you could get 4 different kinds of baked beans, cabbage casserole, and all kinds of pies for dessert. It was a real deal because everything was made from scratch. Alice and her friends would soak the beans overnight and put them in the oven early on Saturday mornings. They'd set up fellowship hall with tables, chairs, and place settings. They'd shred cabbage and bake it together with hamburger meat and tomato sauce in this concoction that sounds terrible, but it was actually delicious. And they'd bake fresh lemon meringue, apple, and chocolate cream pies. Soon, people from all over the county were coming to the bean suppers. Supper wouldn't be served until 5, and later they had to add a second seating because it was so popular. But it wasn't served until 5, but people would start showing up at 3 in the afternoon to sit and talk and to play cards as the smell of baked beans filled the air. And people started joining the church. Alice and her bean suppers had brought the church back from the brink of extinction. Past the time we left the church to move here to Media, the bean supper tradition continued, and the women's auxiliary continued to make significant financial contributions to the church. And up until close to her death in 2009, Alice continued to be the head of the bean suppers. She had the final say over what was served and who could serve it. Men were only allowed to wash the dishes. Children were only allowed to set and clear the tables. And if you were a woman in the church, you knew that you had finally arrived, and you received the ultimate compliment from Alice when she allowed you to serve the meal. Now, Alice wasn't much concerned with issues of theology, although she was a devout Universalist. Alice wasn't a warm and cuddly woman, although she dearly loved her church and everyone in it. Alice didn't have years and years of higher education, but she was smart and determined. Alice and Bob didn't have a whole lot in the way of material possessions, but Alice gave of her time and her talent generously with the best interest of her beloved church in mind. She served and ultimately saved the small community that was so important to her. And it was Alice who made sure that that church was there when Irene and I and Rebecca and Julia arrived. Here we are deep into the 21st century, and I have to say there aren't many Alices to be found. Life is different now than it was back then. And in fact, I'm sad to report that the Beans Supper tradition at the Yarmouth Church has gone away. It went away just a few years after Alice died. But even though she's gone, Alice can serve as a role model and an inspiration to all of us. Even if we can't all be Alices, we can find ways to serve each other. Each week, as you know, if you've been coming here recently, we highlight a service opportunity from the pulpit. And today, following the service, and maybe before the service you were there, you can go out to the ministry fair and find countless opportunities to get involved and help support the church as well as the wider community. And our ongoing program, Growth Through Service, gives us all a framework to find ways to serve each other while growing in spirit and deepening our own sense of self. As Unitarian Universalists, we are called, as that hymn said this morning, to serve the common good and make our own days glad. I love that line. To serve the common good and make our own days glad. The principles of our faith that call us to act in ways that affirm and promote our interdependence and that move us to work toward a world of justice, equity, and compassion call us into service for the sake of others. True spiritual growth in ourselves and in our congregation arises through our connectedness with others and through serving a higher purpose that is greater than our own individual needs. That is one of the statements of theological grounding of our Growth Through Service project. It goes on to say, in that way, service to our church community becomes a sacred experience, one in which our relationships are defined by a sense of caring, respect, commitment, and responsibility. And so, my friends, today I invite you to ask not what your congregation can do for you, but what you can do for your congregation. Let's all try to be a little bit like Alice. This day and every day, I wish you peace. Amen.